She wasn't supposed to stay long. But the moment she said, "I'm not just visiting," everything changed. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind where the hum of the city seeped through the slightly cracked window, and the apartment felt like my own little world. I had just settled with a cup of coffee and a notebook, half watching the dim streetlights flicker outside, when a sudden knock on the door jolted me out of my quiet routine. Expecting my neighbor or maybe a delivery, I opened the door to a presence that immediately felt different. She stood there, mid-40s, poised and effortlessly composed, a quiet confidence radiating from her. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the dim light just enough to make it shimmer. She smiled, a small, knowing curl of her lips, and casually held a bag at her side. But it wasn't the bag or even the casual elegance of her outfit that struck me. It was the sense that she belonged here, though she shouldn't. "I'm not just visiting," she said, her voice calm yet warm, like a gentle tide pulling at the edges of something I didn't even realize was fraying. There was no preamble, no awkward excuse, just a statement that hung in the doorway, asserting a presence that I wasn't sure I was ready for. I stepped aside, letting her in, aware of every subtle detail. The faint scent of her perfume, something floral yet grounded, and the way the apartment seemed to shrink slightly around her presence, as though it were adjusting to accommodate her. She moved with an easy grace, brushing past the hallway with a casual familiarity that made my heart thrum in an odd, unsettled rhythm. My eyes traced her movements, the slight tilt of her head as she examined the room, the way her hand lightly brushed the doorframe, fingertips grazing it like a thought being tested. I found myself unusually observant, noting the quiet confidence in her posture, the gentle but deliberate way she carried herself. There was a warmth in her presence, subtle but insistent, and I felt a mix of curiosity and hesitation knotting in my chest. She noticed my gaze, and instead of pulling away, she held it just long enough to create that strange, fluttering tension that made my palms slightly clammy. We exchanged casual pleasantries, but every word was underlined with an unspoken subtext. Even the simplest gestures, her brief glance toward the kitchen, the soft weight of her hand as she adjusted her bag strap, felt intimate in a way that made my thoughts spiral. I could feel her energy, calm and grounded, and yet it was quietly provocative, drawing me in with a pull I couldn't name. As she settled into the apartment with a familiarity that unsettled and intrigued me, I realized how sharply aware I had become of her, the subtle curve of her smile, the rhythm of her breathing, the quiet way she claimed space without demanding it. And just like that, the ordinary evening I had been content with shifted into something charged, delicate, and unpredictable. By the time she wandered into the living room, setting her bag down, I could feel the flutter in my chest again, stronger this time, like the city outside was holding its breath with me. She had arrived, and though she claimed she wasn't just visiting, I couldn't yet tell what else she had come to claim. The room, my attention, or maybe something I hadn't known I was missing. And for the first time that evening, I realized that nothing would feel ordinary again. The first few days after she arrived were a subtle dance of proximity and observation. She didn't announce her every move or demand attention. Instead, she existed quietly in the shared spaces of my apartment, and that was what made her presence so captivating. The kitchen became a stage for small, almost imperceptible interactions. She would move around effortlessly, reaching for ingredients or utensils, her hand occasionally brushing against mine when we both reached for the same thing. Each touch was fleeting, a whisper of connection that sent a tiny, unbidden thrill up my arm. I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The way her hair fell against her neck when she leaned forward to stir something on the stove, the soft cadence of her voice as she murmured to herself while reading a recipe, the slight crease in her brow when she focused. She wasn't trying to impress me, yet every movement held a quiet grace, a magnetism that was impossible to ignore. I'd catch myself staring for a moment too long and quickly look away, cheeks warming, my thoughts tangled between admiration and something I couldn't yet name. Even mundane moments became charged with subtle tension. On the balcony, she would stand near the railing, looking at the city lights, and I'd feel compelled to linger nearby. The air carried the faint scent of her perfume, mingling with the evening breeze, and the sound of her laughter, soft, natural, made the space feel smaller, more intimate. Our conversations were casual, often about nothing at all, the weather, a funny observation from the day, or a book she'd read. And yet, each word, each pause, seemed layered with unspoken meaning. Physical proximity became a delicate game. She would sometimes sit near me on the couch, our knees almost touching, the heat of her presence brushing against my skin. When she reached for the same book or mug, our fingers would graze, and a subtle shiver of awareness would run through me. I tried to keep my reactions neutral, but the warmth of her hand, the gentle pressure when our shoulders brushed, and the faint beat of her pulse through the brief touches left a lingering impression. There were moments when she caught me observing her, and instead of embarrassment, she'd offer a small, knowing smile, one that hinted at recognition without words. It made my heart race in a way that was equal parts thrilling and unnerving. I realized I was learning her patterns, her quiet habits, and yet I remained painfully aware of the distance imposed by our age difference, as if the universe had given me a glimpse of intimacy I wasn't entirely allowed to claim. By the end of the day, even after she retreated to her room for the night, the apartment felt charged, alive with the memory of her presence. I would sit quietly, replaying small interactions, the brush of her fingers against mine, the tilt of her head, the warmth in her gaze, and feel a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. Each moment together was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, and I knew that the longer she stayed, the more difficult it would become to treat our proximity as merely casual. That night, lying in bed, I realized that the apartment no longer belonged solely to me. It was shared, reshaped by her quiet presence, and I was both thrilled and terrified by the way it made me feel. Something subtle but profound had begun, a slow intertwining of attention, curiosity, and unspoken desire. And I knew, with a kind of startled clarity, that this was only the beginning. It was on the third evening that our shared spaces started to feel less like coincidence and more like an unspoken routine. She had settled into a quiet rhythm within the apartment, moving through rooms with the same gentle confidence that had first caught my attention. And I, in turn, found myself lingering, watching her, listening to her, absorbing every subtle gesture that made her presence feel alive. We had taken to sitting in the living room together, ostensibly reading or scrolling on our phones, but there was an unspoken understanding that these moments were more than they seemed. I noticed the way she curled her fingers around a mug of tea, the warmth of the porcelain seeping into her palms, and the faint tilt of her head when she read something that amused or intrigued her. I wanted to reach out, to trace that curve with my hand, but hesitation anchored me. The age difference, the social expectations, the simple fear of crossing an invisible line. Everything made me careful, deliberate, painfully aware of every movement. And yet, in the midst of that hesitation, she began to open small windows into her world. One night, as the rain tapped softly against the window, she began talking about her childhood, casually mentioning a memory of a favorite park she had loved as a girl. Her voice was soft, tinged with nostalgia, and I could hear a subtle vulnerability underneath the calm surface she usually presented. I found myself sharing in return little details about my own past, work, dreams, and regrets. There was a rhythm to it, a delicate balance of give and take that made the room feel charged, intimate without being intrusive. Physical proximity mirrored our emotional closeness. On the couch, we would sit side by side, the air between us so thin that I could feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder, the gentle brush of her elbow as she shifted. Sometimes, in moments of animated storytelling or laughter, our knees would touch, fleetingly, sending a ripple of awareness through me that I had to suppress. I would notice how she seemed completely unaware, or perhaps deliberately unbothered, by these minor brushes, which only made me more conscious of my own reactions. Her presence had a grounding effect on me. I felt calmer, yet strangely more alert, as though every thought I had about myself or the world was filtered through the lens of her proximity. There were pauses in our conversations where neither of us spoke, and in those silences, the tension simmered, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. I caught her gaze lingering on me once or twice, and even though she looked away quickly, I could sense a similar curiosity, a mirrored hesitation, that matched my own. By the end of the evening, As she excused herself for the night, the apartment felt emptier than before she arrived, but in a different way, charged with possibility, a quiet expectation of what the next day might bring. I lay in bed replaying her stories, her soft laughter, the fleeting touches, and felt a strange, warm ache, a desire to be closer, to understand her more deeply, and yet a careful restraint that I could not ignore. Something was growing between us, subtle and unspoken, a slow weaving of trust and curiosity. I knew then that this was no longer just casual observation or fleeting attraction. The emotional tether had begun, fragile and tentative, but impossible to ignore. And I was both terrified and exhilarated by how much I wanted to see where it might lead. The days had settled into a quiet rhythm, but now, every ordinary interaction carried a weight I could no longer ignore. Simple tasks, cooking, tidying the apartment, even reaching for the same object, felt charged with anticipation. There was a new awareness in the way we moved around each other, a subtle flirtation that neither of us needed to name aloud. One evening, we decided to cook together. I was chopping vegetables while she stirred a sauce on the stove. Our conversation was light, teasing, about the way I oversalted everything, about the odd habits we had developed over the years. But underneath it, the air was thick with tension. At one point, I reached for the same spoon she was holding. Our fingers brushed, just slightly, but long enough for a jolt to travel up my arm. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave the smallest of smiles, eyes glinting with a kind of quiet amusement. That tiny, fleeting connection lingered far longer in my mind than the conversation we had been having. There were other moments of accidental intimacy. As she leaned over to check the oven, her hand briefly rested on my shoulder to steady herself. The warmth of her touch was immediate, like the quiet pulse of a hidden current running through the apartment. My instincts told me to pull back, but a strange, almost magnetic force held me in place. I felt the weight of her presence, the faint fragrance of her perfume, the subtle heat of her skin against mine, and all of it made my heart race. Even when we weren't touching, the flirtation was in the pauses, the way her gaze would linger a beat longer than necessary, the gentle tilt of her head when she laughed, the subtle brush of her fingers along the edge of a counter as she moved past me. Every small gesture became amplified, charged with possibility. I became acutely aware of her proximity, the softness of her shoulder against mine, the way her hand hovered near mine on purpose, or perhaps by accident, but I could no longer tell the difference. There were moments when our teasing escalated into playful challenges. She would nudge me gently, and I would retaliate with a mock protest, only to feel the warmth of her hand linger in mine for just an extra second too long. Each touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement that there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken but undeniably present. By the end of the evening, we had moved from the kitchen to the living room, still lingering in the same space, our knees brushing as we sat side by side. The flirtation had softened into a quiet, intimate awareness. The way she seemed fully at ease with me, the way I felt both exhilarated and strangely protective in her presence. It was a delicate balance of desire and restraint, a tension that made every glance, every smile, every accidental brush of fingers feel monumental. As I lay in bed that night, replaying the evening, I realized that our connection had shifted. It was no longer subtle curiosity or casual observation. It had grown into something tactile, something that reached beyond words. And though neither of us had said anything, I knew in my chest that the first true flicker of desire had ignited, slow and steady, impossible to ignore. It was a quiet night when the weight of everything between us began to press against the fragile barrier of hesitation. The apartment was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as the city outside hummed softly in the background. We had ended up on the balcony, leaning against the railing, looking out over the scattered lights. There was a comfortable silence at first, the kind that only comes when two people are beginning to understand each other in ways that words cannot capture. Then she spoke, softly, almost as if testing the air before letting her thoughts escape. She spoke of loneliness, not dramatic or anguished, but the quiet kind that settles in a person over years. She mentioned the routines that had become predictable, the small joys she rarely allowed herself, and the way certain moments in life seemed to pass unnoticed. Her voice was calm, but beneath it, I could hear a subtle tremor of vulnerability, a softness I hadn't glimpsed before. I felt my chest tighten. Normally, I could navigate casual conversation easily, but this was different. Her openness made the room feel smaller, more intimate. I found myself sharing in turn, not grand confessions, but little pieces of my own insecurities, moments when I felt inexperienced, unsure of myself, or painfully aware of the age gap that separated us. There was a pause after my words, a delicate silence in which neither of us pulled away. Then she did something small but devastating in its intimacy. She reached out and touched my arm lightly. The contact was brief, almost incidental, but I could feel it all the way to my chest. Her fingers lingered just long enough for me to sense the warmth, the steadiness of her touch, and the unspoken encouragement it carried. I didn't move away. I couldn't. The air between us seemed to thrum with something unacknowledged yet profoundly present. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture, spoke louder than words. The city lights reflected in her eyes as she looked at me, and I caught a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. We were aware of the tension, the pull that neither of us dared to name aloud, but we also seemed willing to linger in it, to explore the closeness without crossing the line. There was an ache in my chest, a mixture of desire and hesitation. I wanted to lean closer, to close the small space between us, but the weight of reality, the age difference, the uncertainty, the fear of misstepping, kept me rooted. And yet, in that restraint, the intimacy deepened. There was trust in allowing vulnerability to exist without forcing it into declaration. As the night wore on and we eventually moved back inside, the atmosphere had shifted. We weren't just two people occupying the same apartment anymore. There was a connection, fragile and tentative, that threaded through the quiet touches, the shared confidences, and the lingering glances. I knew that something significant had started, something that would demand courage, patience, and honesty if it were to grow. And even as I lay in bed later, replaying the subtle moments, the brush of her hand, the softness in her voice, the quiet intensity of her gaze, I felt a thrill mingled with fear. Desire and hesitation coexisted in a delicate balance, and I realized that I had never wanted anything so carefully, so completely, in my life. The apartment had grown warmer, cozier, as if it had absorbed the presence of our growing connection. That evening, we found ourselves side by side on the couch, a shared blanket draped loosely across our laps. The television was on, but neither of us paid much attention to it. The story unfolding on the screen was secondary to the unspoken narrative weaving between us. There was a gentle rhythm to the way we breathed, an awareness of each other's presence that made even ordinary moments feel intimate. She leaned against my shoulder lightly, just enough to feel weight and warmth without demanding attention. I could sense the quiet pulse of her body, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the subtle brush of her hair against my cheek. I didn't move away. Instead, I adjusted slightly, letting her find comfort in that small closeness, feeling the tension in my chest ease into something tender and profound. Our hands were resting near each other, and gradually, my fingers brushed against hers. The contact was accidental, or so I told myself, but neither of us moved our hands away. The warmth of her skin, the softness, the slight pressure when our fingers lingered, carried an unspoken message, acknowledgement of desire, curiosity, and trust. Every subtle touch amplified the awareness between us, a silent dance of emotions neither of us had fully articulated. Conversation had become quieter, more deliberate. We exchanged soft, teasing comments, gentle laughter, and shared observations about things only we noticed in each other. Every glance carried weight. When she tilted her head to look at me, there was a fleeting vulnerability in her eyes, as though she were testing the waters, gauging my response without words. I felt compelled to meet her gaze fully, letting my own emotions show, even if only subtly. At one point, she adjusted her position, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and I instinctively reached out, letting my hand hover near hers. The air between us seemed to pulse with the possibilities that had been building over weeks, the unspoken admissions, the quiet desire, the slow-burning attraction that had grown from casual observation to intimate awareness. It was a delicate balance, closeness without overstepping, intimacy without words, tension without fear. The beauty of this moment was in its restraint. We had not confessed, not even hinted at the depth of what we felt, yet the connection was undeniable. Each touch, each lingering gaze, each shared breath communicated volumes more than words could. There was trust in our patience, in the careful way we navigated this new territory, allowing intimacy to deepen naturally, without force. By the time the evening drew to a close, I felt a quiet certainty in the emotional bond we were forming. She returned to her room, and I lingered in the living room, replaying the subtle interactions, the warmth of her shoulder against mine, the delicate brush of our fingers, the quiet acknowledgement in her gaze. Desire and restraint coexisted, delicate yet powerful, and I understood that the next steps, emotional honesty, unspoken confessions, and physical tenderness, were waiting just beyond the threshold of that night. It was a turning point. We were no longer merely sharing a space or exchanging glances. We were entwining in a way that demanded patience, respect, and courage. And the thought of what could come next made my heart beat with a mix of anticipation and reverent longing. Lighty, I watched her move through the small space with that same effortless grace that had first drawn me in, but now it was softened by the familiarity of routine. The apartment felt fully alive, not because of its furniture or its walls, but because of the way our presence had intertwined over the days we had spent together. We were preparing breakfast, working side by side in the kitchen. The mundane act of cooking, which once would have felt ordinary, now carried an undercurrent of intimacy. I noticed the warmth of her hand as she passed me a knife, the way her elbow brushed mine lightly, and the soft laugh that followed when I pretended to be clumsy chopping vegetables. Each touch, each glance, was a continuation of the slow dance we had been sharing, a rhythm that had grown from curiosity to deep connection. When I reached for a mug, her hand touched mine again. This time, I didn't hesitate. Our fingers intertwined naturally, comfortably, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her warmth grounding me. There was no need for words. The touch carried all the understanding, all the acknowledgement of what had grown between us. The age difference, which had once felt like an unspoken boundary, now seemed insignificant in the face of the emotional bond we had nurtured. We moved to the small balcony, coffee in hand, the city stretching out below us. She leaned against me lightly, her head brushing my shoulder. I could feel the soft weight of her, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and I felt a peace I hadn't known I needed. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just the simple, undeniable truth of two people choosing to share this quiet, intimate space together. Our conversation was casual, yet every word carried meaning. She spoke about her plans for the day, and I found myself listening with a focus I had never given anyone before. When I smiled at her, she returned it with that familiar, knowing curl of her lips, and the shared warmth between us felt like a silent promise. As we prepared to part for the day, she reached for my hand again, squeezing it gently before letting go. "I'm glad you stayed," she murmured softly, her eyes holding mine. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet acknowledgement of connection, of trust, of something deeper than mere attraction. I felt a steady, profound joy at hearing those words, at knowing that what had begun as subtle curiosity had grown into a bond neither of us needed to define aloud. Even as she left briefly to run errands, I lingered in the apartment, replaying the touches, the glances, the quiet intimacy that had shaped our days. The world outside could wait. In this small, shared space, we had found something rare, a connection built on patience, understanding, and genuine care. And in that moment, I realized that what mattered wasn't declarations or labels, but the simple act of being present, of allowing affection, trust, and desire to unfold naturally. The age gap, the hesitation, the uncertainty, they all faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of closeness, the beauty of subtle touch, and the undeniable comfort of being seen by someone who understood you completely. It was not an ending in the traditional sense. It was the beginning of something quietly extraordinary, slow and tender, yet fully ours.